All right, once again, I wanted to start with a silly little example applying terms from a prior video. So let's look at this little meme on the right. How do you do it? One mom asks, and she says, simple. Whenever he starts crying, just give him his teddy, right? That quiets the kid down. Meanwhile, the little kid at the bottom explains things from his perspective. How does he do it? Easy, just start crying, and mom gives me a teddy every time. Now, there are two interesting behaviors here we can analyze, mom's behavior and baby's behavior. So mom's behavior is giving the teddy bear. When she does that behavior, the crying stimulus is removed afterward. So in the future, she's more likely to give the teddy giving behavior, right? To give the teddy to the kid when the kid is crying. That means we've had negative reinforcement of her teddy giving behavior. But the part mom might not realize becomes more obvious when we also analyze the baby's behavior, which is crying. When the kid does the crying behavior, a teddy bear shows up. Something is added. And if the kid likes his teddy bear, that means the crying behavior will be reinforced. It'll become more likely in the future. So that's positive reinforcement of the crying behavior. Mom is literally training the kid to cry more just because the teddy bear makes the kid quiet in the short run. Oops. All right. Anyway, let's move on to this video's topic, which is extinction, but now applied to operant conditioning rather than respondent conditioning. So in operant conditioning, extinction is when we start withholding reinforcement for a previously reinforced response. Basically, when the behavior stops paying off. In other words, you change the whole R leads to SR contingency so that R doesn't have that consequence anymore. So in this graph, in the sort of yellowish part on the left, we were doing acquisition. We were reinforcing the behavior. So you can see not only are the cumulative number of responses going up, but it reaches a pretty steady slope, right? It's going up at a certain rate. Little tick marks show where it was getting reinforcers for every few responses. So this is not a CRF scenario. But then in the purple part of the graph, starting around minute 13, we're no longer reinforcing the behavior. So no tick marks are showing up on the graph, right? And notice how the behavior goes from that nice, steady upward slope to a leveling off and becoming more flat, meaning much less behavior over time, a slower rate of behavior. So the result of extinction is the rate of behavior eventually goes down, possibly stopping altogether. So by the end of this graph, after extinction has been happening a while, the slope is flat. The rate of behavior is basically zero, no more behavior. Here's another example, just a different graph, but of the same basic thing. So we've got a cumulative record of how many responses have happened, how many behaviors there are on the y-axis there. We see it happening at a particular rate, in this case a pretty damn steep slope here in the left part of the graph, when the reinforcement was coming every 10 behaviors or whatever. Then we start extinction, the right part of the graph. The behavior might continue for a while, right? But eventually it starts leveling out because the brain picks up on the new pattern, that it's not working anymore. So we again end up with a flattened slope, an operant rate that's, low or close to zero. That said, in operant conditioning, we consistently note something very interesting that happens during extinction. Specifically, right when we start extinction, something happens. We consistently observe something called extinction burst. So at the start of extinction, the behavior paradoxically goes up for a little while. For the purposes of understanding and predicting behavior, we don't really need to get inside anyone's head or assume animals are having linguistic thoughts or anything. But as a casual shorthand, you might just think of this as like the rat or the kid or whatever is thinking, why isn't the lever giving me food anymore? I should try this harder. Lever, 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 right? But pretty soon it's going to be clear the behavior has stopped working. The rules have actually changed. The contingency is no longer active. So the behavior does in fact finally stop after this extinction burst. And this is a really classic phenomenon to observe in children when you change the rules on them. Like if you go from being kind of lenient to being a little more strict. For example, maybe a dad brought some cookies home from the store, right? And that day, his toddler starts throwing a tantrum, demanding cookies. Dad's going to get frustrated by the crying, and maybe he gives in. He gives the kid a cookie to shut her up. And she does calm down. Great. But then the next day, when the kid sees the cookie jar, she starts crying again and throwing a tantrum until dad finally gives in and gives her a cookie to calm her down. By the third day, she's even more likely to do the crying behavior because her behavior is being positively reinforced. It's leading to a cookie. Now, at this point, dad might think back to the learning class he took in college and realize the mistake he was making, right? So he decides on day 4, he's going to stop giving her cookies to calm down the tantrums. And what happens? What's going to happen when he stops giving the cookies? Let's look at our graph of tantrum behavior here. On those first few days, or the next few days, the first few days of extinction, the tantrum behavior might get even worse. The toddler sees the cookie jar, throws her tantrum, but now she isn't even rewarded with a cookie. So rather than stopping immediately, she might actually get worse for a while. Like, the tantrum used to work. Why isn't it working now? Maybe I need to tantrum harder. But if the dad sticks to his guns and is consistent about the rule change, if he's consistent about the contingency change and keeps doing the extinction setup, eventually that tantrum behavior is going to go down, 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 or go away completely. And yeah, just a side note here in case this is confusing, this graph is not drawn as a cumulative record. So here we're just looking at the overall tantrum, like an overall tantrum rating each day. But if we were counting each tantrum behavior on a cumulative record, you'd basically see a nice steady rate, so a steady upward slope for those first few days, then an even steeper rate for a little while during the extinction burst, then it would start leveling off and flattening out. And when we're down to 0 behavior per day, that's when the cumulative record would be totally flat, behavior of 0 behaviors per day. Now, what else happens during extinction, aside from that extinction burst? Well, for one thing, they start trying new variations of the behavior. We always see this anytime extinction starts. We call this operant variability, just meaning we see more variability in the operant, more variability in how the operant behavior R is being performed. So in more kind of casual but less scientific terms, basically they're like, why isn't this behavior working? Maybe if I try this, right? So let's think about an example. Like, if you've got a rat in a Skinner box that's been trained to get treats for sticking its nose into a hole, what you might notice during your study is that basically it'll always stick its head into that hole the same way, at the same angle, the same part of the hole. We call this stereotyped topography. Now, topography just means shape, kind of like a map of something. So we're saying the shape of the behavior, the specifics of how they do that nose sticking behavior is stereotyped. It's always the same. But if you stop giving treats, if you start doing extinction, you'll notice that they'll start sticking their head in at different angles. They'll start trying out different parts of the hole and moving their paw into the hole and so on. They're varying the topography of their operant response. That is operant variability, and it consistently happens anytime you start doing extinction. Just as a side note though, if you start giving treats again, like if you turn it back on, they'll stick to whatever version of the behavior they were doing when it started working again, and that becomes the new stereotyped version of the behavior. That becomes their new preferred topography for that response to get their treats. Okay, what else happens during extinction? Well, creatures also tend to make the response more forcefully for a while. Again, in less scientific, more casual or intuitive terms, you might think of this like, why isn't this working anymore? What the hell? Try harder! Like, if the button on a video game stops doing what it's supposed to do, you might smash it a little harder. Or if the rat stops getting rewarded for lever pressing that used to give it food, it might really push down hard on the lever to see if that works. Now, really, if you think about it, this may just be more of that last effect that we already documented, operant variability, right? You could think of it as they're just varying the force of the response. That's one element of the response topography, and they're just varying that to see what might work. But there's an alternative explanation here for why we see this forcefulness, and that's that maybe the forceful response is a form of emotional response. An emotional response just meaning behaviors that indicate frustration or aggressive behaviors or things like that. Like, For a human, you can imagine getting mad and hitting a vending machine when it doesn't produce the reinforcer for your coin inserting behavior, or maybe even just pushing the buttons much harder to see if that works when it eats your money. So we've got at least a couple theoretical reasons why we might see this consistent behavioral pattern when extinction begins. But what else happens during extinction? Well, thankfully, they will eventually catch on to the new situation, and their responding decreases greatly. This is consistent. As soon as you do extinction, you might have some stuff going on initially that's kind of counterintuitive, like the extinction burst, but eventually the responding will decrease if it's no longer being reinforced. So it'll eventually go back basically to its operant level, the baseline level of the operant response. Not only that, but extinction can go quite a bit smoother if some stimulus in the environment tells them when extinction is happening. In that case, it can function as a signal to not respond right now, a signal that the contingency isn't active. So again, we might compare one context where a discriminative stimulus, let's say tone 1, sets the occasion for the behavior because it signals that the R leads to reinforcer contingency is active. Basically, game on, and they're going to press the lever. But we might also have an S delta, or maybe one exists in the environment to tell you things have changed, like the vending machine is unplugged, so it's not working anymore, but there might also be an S delta, which is the fact that the vending machine lights are off, right? So in this case, we might set it up on purpose by just using a separate tone to tell the rat that we're doing extinction now. So we have some other tone, we'll call it tone 2, that might signal extinction is happening. Basically, why bother? And they're not going to press the lever. So if the environment has those consistent signals, extinction goes much faster and smoother, and pretty soon that S delta is going to set the occasion for not responding. Now, there's one more important detail to know when you go to do some extinction on your learner. Sometimes extinction doesn't work as well as you might expect or predict, and there's a big consistent reason why. To explain this, remember that earlier we talked about CRF, or continuous reinforcement, being the contingency setup where you give the reinforcer every single time they do the behavior. But at the time I mentioned, there are other options. For example, intermittent reinforcement, meaning you reinforce them for the behavior, but not every time they do it. That's actually a very common contingency, both in testing that we do, but also in just real life experiences that we have where we get reinforcement. So examples of intermittent reinforcement would be setups like every few times the dog sits, I give him a treat. Maybe he has to do it 3 to 6 times, and somewhere in there I'll give him a treat. Or exactly every 10 times that you do the dishes, you will earn sexy times from your spouse. Or for each employee, I, as the manager, might occasionally give out a gift card after they make a sale. Not every sale, make it a little unpredictable, but on average, I'll reward them about once a week, sometimes sooner, sometimes later. Or maybe every 14 days, and it's consistent. Every 14 days, every 2 weeks, you get a paycheck to reinforce your showing up and working behavior at your job. All of these involve intermittent reinforcement. You don't get the reinforcer every single time you do the behavior. Now, how does this relate to extinction, since that's what this video is about? Well, we've found that when you train someone or something using intermittent reinforcement, it's actually much harder to extinguish the behavior than if you'd been giving them a reinforcer every time. So there's this resistance to extinction when you use intermittent reinforcement, which is good if you want the behavior to stick around, even though it's not always rewarded, but it's a bad thing if you're trying to get the behavior to go away and it's sticking around even though you stopped giving reinforcers for it. Now, my question for you is, why do you think this happens? Shouldn't being rewarded every time make you more likely to keep responding longer? Like, why does CRF lead to quicker extinction? This is a really important phenomena, so don't just cruise past this part of the video. Actually take a moment to pause and try and think about it for a minute. Okay, and if you're still stuck, here's a hint. Put yourself in the shoes of a rat that's getting reinforced every single time. So that's a CRF schedule. And then think about putting yourself in the shoes of a rat that's just getting reinforced every once in a while. It has to do the behavior a few times, and just sometimes, unpredictably, it gets a reward for that. Now, when extinction starts for these two rats, which rat is the first to notice that the lever doesn't always work anymore? See if that helps answer the original question. Again, pause, try and figure it out if you haven't yet. So this effect, this thing we're noticing, has a name. It's actually called the partial reinforcement effect, PRE. Sometimes you'll see it written as the partial reinforcement extinction effect, PREE. So if you Google it, you might run into that phrasing. At any rate, the effect is that extinction is harder to accomplish if you've been doing intermittent reinforcement compared to continuous reinforcement. And the simplest way to think about why this happens goes like this. On an intermittent schedule, the creature is used to going a little while without reinforcement. So there's less obvious information that the contingency has changed to extinction. In other words, it's harder to discriminate the original contingency versus this new extinction setup. It's harder to tell those setups apart, so it takes longer to catch on, and that's why we see the behavior continue even when we stop reinforcing it. In CRF, though, right, in continuous reinforcement, it's different. When you start extinction, for someone who's been getting rewarded every single time, when you start extinction, the first 30 behaviors after that, the first 30 responses are all going to provide some information and evidence about the new setup. They're going to be like, what the hell? I'm getting robbed. Every time they press it, they're not getting a reward. And that's like, that's weird. That's not working. So they're getting a lot of new info about the new setup of extinction. But in intermittent reinforcement, let's say you were reinforcing every 10th response, every 10th time they did the behavior. When you start extinction, those first 30 responses they do after that are only going to provide 3 clues about the new setup, not 30 clues, right? So that's the main theoretical explanation for this partial reinforcement effect. It takes longer for the brain to get enough new information to recognize that the pattern has changed. Like if things were more unpredictable back when the intermittent contingency was active, then it's going to be harder to know that things have changed when no reward starts coming out. And speaking of extinction, just like with respondent conditioning, we find that the learning isn't erased or forgotten or unlearned during extinction in operant conditioning. Indeed, we find effects in operant conditioning very similar to what we found in respondent conditioning. We'll actually use the same terms for these. So for example, we see spontaneous recovery. After extinction has been happening, the operant behavior might have declined a lot or gone away, but after some time has passed, for example, you sleep and come back the next day, when we return to that original context, the behavior comes back briefly. Despite there still being no reinforcement, even though there's still an extinction, the behavior kind of comes back a little bit for a while. So on the graph here, this isn't a cumulative record, right? This is just measuring how much behavior occurred in a given day or a given session. We've got a steady rate of the behavior happening, and then reinforcement is removed, meaning we start extinction, right? Notice the behavior initially jumps up. That's extinction burst, just as we would expect. But with some time, you keep doing extinction, the behavior will go down and eventually may go away completely, right? It's down to 0. But notice after some delay or a night of sleep or something like that, the behavior can come back again briefly, though only partially. That would be spontaneous recovery. And our sort of unscientific but intuitive way of thinking about it might be like this. During extinction, like the rat is thinking, this stupid lever is broken. I should stop pressing it, right? It's figured out that the lever is broken, and they do stop. But after some sleep, when they return the next day, they're brought back to the Skinner box, they might say to themselves something like, this looks familiar. The old food dispensing lever is here. I should press it to get some food. Or, right, that's oversimplifying. We don't think they're actually, having that linguistic thought in their head or anything. But more realistically, you can think of it like the brain having some uncertainty about what rule is active right now, because the pattern is kind of ambiguous, right? It's got evidence from some points in its life. It's got evidence that the lever does not work from all that extinction experience yesterday. But also the context is similar to back when the lever did work. So some moderate amount of the behavior ends up being evoked, almost like a way of collecting more information to help disambiguate between those two situations. At which point it will become clear the lever is not working, the behavior will extinguish again, go back down to 0 quickly. And just like with respondent conditioning, we don't just have spontaneous recovery, we also see renewal in operant conditioning. So if the original contingency was learned in context A, like doing the behavior leads to a treat, doing the behavior leads to a treat, doing the behavior leads to a treat, that's the learning, that's operant conditioning in the first context. Then we might do extinction, but if we do extinction in a different context, like a different room, then we get a return of the behavior when we later go back to context A, or even a new context, a new room or something like that, like context C, even if we're not rewarding the behavior anymore, even if it's still extinction, just by moving them back to that first context, they'll start doing the behavior again that they had given up. So basically, you could think of it like in the red room, pressing the lever gets me food. They really learn that. Then we take them to the blue room. Now I'm in the blue room, pressing the lever does nothing. I'm going to stop pressing the lever. That's extinction. Now we'll keep extinction going. The lever doesn't start again, but just by bringing them back to the red room, the rat might start hitting the lever again. Or bring them to a new like green room, they'll start hitting the lever. And sure enough, in operant conditioning, we also have reinstatement, just like with respondent conditioning. So after extinction's been happening, the operant behavior might have declined a lot or gone away, but if you happen to just toss one reinforcer in there for free, no contingency involved, they don't have to do anything for it, the behavior can start up strongly again for at least a little while. Like, if your dog had stopped getting treats for playing dead, you did extinction, right? You stopped giving it treats for playing dead, it's now stopped playing dead. The behavior is gone, but if your friend visits and just happens to toss your dog one of those treats that it used to get for that behavior, the dog might suddenly start playing dead out of the blue, right? It got the treat for free from the friend. It wasn't doing the behavior and getting rewarded. It just happened to get the same treat as a sort of reminder of the old days. The dog then starts doing the behavior again. It starts playing dead sort of out of the blue. So for our rat in the Skinner box, you might think of it like the little rat is thinking, this lever hasn't been working at all for these past 2 hours, but suddenly I got a pellet out of nowhere. So things must be back to normal. The lever must be working again. I should go hit that lever. That's reinstatement. And you can see how it's super similar and totally analogous to how reinstatement happened after extinction in respondent conditioning. So all of those effects that we saw in respondent conditioning, spontaneous recovery, renewal, reinstatement, same kind of ideas here for operant conditioning. All right. Well, in this video and this general topic of operant basics, just going over an applied example from real life. In this case, parenting. So this example is straight out of the Pearson trainee behavior analysis book. We've got some parents who were accidentally rewarding their child with attention when the child cried during bedtime. Now, let's first look at the line with circles. Just look at the circle line here. This is when parents got some help maybe from a behavior analyst and decided we're going to stop giving attention to the child when it cries. Stop giving positive reinforcement of the crying behavior, in other words. Notice there's an extinction burst at the very beginning. So that first night of the new system, the kid cries for 45 minutes. But quickly things improve, and after a week or so, the kid no longer cries at all at bedtime. It's worked. That's our line with the circles. Extinction worked. Cool. But then the aunt shows up to visit, and she starts paying attention to the crying kid again. Oops, the crying comes back. So maybe the parents explain to her why they no longer run to the kid and give attention to reward the crying. And the aunt, she understands, she gets it. And now she also stops paying attention to the crying. Thus, we've got sort of a second round of extinction for the kid. That's the line with the triangles here. Notice the crying behavior extinguishes, but it extinguishes slower this next time. That's kind of interesting. Extinction is slower the second time. So you might pause the video and try and guess why that is based on what we've learned. Well, the best explanation is because overall now the kid has sometimes been reinforced for crying and sometimes not. So it's kind of like an intermittent reinforcement schedule. It resists extinction better than CRF, right? So that second extinction is going to be slower than the first time around when the kid was going from continuous reinforcement to extinction, right? Now it's been in a situation where sometimes the extinction is active, sometimes the extinction is not active, sometimes my crying pays off, sometimes it doesn't. That's intermittent. That's more unpredictable, which means when the aunt does stop, right, when we go into proper extinction again, the brain of the kid doesn't know for sure that that's happening because things have been kind of back and forth, intermittent. So the kid's going to keep trying the behavior for a while, and it'll take longer for the brain to realize, okay, we've definitely got a pattern of extinction now. All right, that's it for this topic. The next big topic, the next set of videos, will really dive deeper into this idea of intermittent reinforcement and kind of all the variations that are possible when we choose how often to provide reinforcement for a behavior. In other words, when we choose the schedule of reinforcement.